Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. And in this video, I'll be starting a bit of a series here, talking about one of my all-time favorite video game series, with that being the Mass Effect series. Now here I'll obviously be talking about the first game, and I do plan on following this up with retrospectives on Mass Effects 2, 3, and Andromeda later down the road, with those three coming out on their respective anniversaries later in the year. Now, as a disclaimer, this retrospective is being made after having played the Mass Effect remaster included within the Legendary Edition, which obviously did include some minor gameplay improvements, which might alter my opinions on the game from what it would have been if I had replayed this on the original release. Though, to be honest, I don't feel like many of my opinions have changed that much, and straight up, despite me loving the Mass Effect series, I never loved the original game here. While I do respect a lot of what it does from a narrative and world building standpoint, I've always found the gameplay of the original game unrefined and just tedious at points. Mass Effect 1 was a game I attempted to play when I was a kid and stopped playing after a few hours, and didn't return to it again until after I'd already played Mass Effects 2 and 3, which, spoiler alert, I like a lot more. But going back to the first game afterwards was pretty tough to do at that point, and while I did end up finishing that playthrough of it, I didn't particularly enjoy my time with it, and really just did it just so that I could have played the entire trilogy in a row. And most times I revisited the series after that, I would just skip to Mass Effect 2. But with the Legendary Edition now being available on modern consoles, obviously I'm a lot less incentivized to do so, and I do feel like my opinion on the game has slightly gone up over time, but again, largely due to my respect for the story it sets up, more so than actually enjoying playing the game itself. Now, as for the game itself, Mass Effect is obviously an action RPG from 2007 developed by BioWare, and it very much feels like it. Even in the remastered version, it does feel like an older school Western RPG. In terms of how the game plays, I think Mass Effect 1 here plays more similarly to something like KOTOR than it does with something like Mass Effect 3, and that can be a good or a bad thing. Now, for what I'm personally looking for in a game, I do prefer the newer style of Mass Effect games, but I can fully understand why someone would like the first game here more, as again, it is a lot more of an RPG heavy game, while the future games kind of hold your hand for a lot of the RPG elements of it. Now, in the original trilogy, you do play as Commander Shepard, though like most BioWare RPGs, you can customize your character's gender, appearance, and backstory. You can also select your class. Again, typical fare for these style of RPGs. Now, I personally never bothered too much with the customization options. On my most recent playthrough, and for most of my playthroughs I've ever done, I just used the preset male Shepard, sometimes the preset female Shepard, but I never really dived too deep into changing their appearance. As for me, I do look at Mass Effect as such a narrative-based experience, and I am so attached to the preset characters, as those are who I played when I originally played the game, that to just change it up now would be really bizarre to me. Now, one of the most notable elements of the Mass Effect trilogy here is the morality system. Now, within the game, you have plenty of conversations with NPCs, and through that, you're given a dialogue wheel, where on the left side, you're typically given options that will give you further context on your objective or add to the world building of the game, while on the right you usually have options that progress the conversation, with those being on top typically being Paragon options, essentially using charm or doing what is normally looked at as morally right, while the options typically on the bottom are Renegade options, usually using intimidation or being more morally ambiguous. And for me, the best way to play the game is to pick one of these two that you're going to stick with throughout your entire playthrough. As in a playthrough where you switch between the two, you do typically miss out on opportunities that are only available if you go all in. Now, that more so is the case for later entries in the series, as in this game, the ability to unlock more Paragon and Renegade options are actually tied to the skills in Shepard's progression, which makes the system feel a lot less important, as you can just very easily unlock both Paragon and Renegade options, unlike in future games where you have to stick to one in order to unlock some of those better options. Now let's talk about how the world is structured here. Essentially, you do have a hub, that being your ship, the Normandy, where on it you can have conversations with your crew. You can talk to each of your party members and build Shepard's relationships with them. Though again, I feel like this is a system that is much improved in further installments over this one, where while you are able to have these conversations to know these characters better, it doesn't really feel like these conversations actually change anything with how the story progresses, unlike it does in future games. But beyond the Normandy, you do also have the galaxy map that allows you to explore systems and select planets, and while the majority of them aren't explorable, there's usually at least one planet per system that is. Now, for these planets, you can typically explore them on the Mako, this rover-esque vehicle that I really hate controlling. And I know this is a common complaint within this game, and I remember even hating it when I first played the game when I was younger, but replaying the game now, you kind of realize that the main story doesn't force you to use the Mako that much, which did surprise me, but when I am forced to use it, I do still hate it, and I do still hate that it is so deeply attached to the side content within the game. Despite there supposedly being improvements here for Legendary Edition, it really doesn't feel like that massive a change, as it still controls pretty clunkily, and I just don't enjoy my time with it. But even beyond that, I do feel like most of the side content in this game does feel very half-assed, where you spend a lot of it just doing the same thing over and over and over again. And a lot of these explorable planets are laid out pretty similarly, with them mostly feeling lifeless, with like pointless objectives there that don't add anything to their overall experience. Within these locations, there's typically outposts and research facilities, but all of these end up being literally the exact same buildings, copy and pasted. To me, it just really felt lazy and just blatant reuse of assets, which obviously all games reuse assets, but when you're playing the game and it really just sticks out to you that they're blatantly reusing assets, it does make it a bit of an issue. Now, for the actual side quests, I do feel like they are hit or miss. I mean, some of them are your boring collectible hunting or fetch quests that you would expect from a typical RPG, while others attempt to tell a semblance of a story, and those are fine, but overall I did feel like the side content in this game is severely lacking, and while I did end up playing the majority of it, I just didn't really enjoy my time with it nearly as much as I would with later games in the series. Now, we can talk about the combat, which again does improve over future installments in my eyes. I mean, each of the games are third-person shooters, with you typically having 2 AI squad members with you. You can pause the action to select abilities to use or to command your crew, which adds a bit of a layer strategy to the combat. But outside of that, I do feel like they make some pretty questionable decisions with the combat within this game. I mean, first up is the fact that weapons in this game have unlimited ammo, with weapons overheating if you use them for prolonged periods. And for me, this made the sniper rifle in particular really overpowered in this game, as you could just continuously shoot shots, which made this my weapon of choice on my most recent playthrough, despite me really never using the sniper in my initial playthroughs of the game. Another aspect of the combat I didn't love here is how clunky the cover system is in this first game. Again, it is improved later on, but in this game, they try to apply this automatic cover system that simply doesn't work that well. And to be honest, most of the time I didn't even bother using it. So again, overall, the gameplay wise, this game does have a lot of clunkiness within it. But what I do still adore from this game, and really this entire series as a whole, is the narrative and the grand scale of its world building. It's still insane to me how much background they give to different races in the game, the politics between the relationships between these races. You have the Asari, Solarians, Turians, Quarians, Krogan, the Geth. Mass Effect is one of the only series across all of media that has made me this interested in the different races within the universe. I do also like the concept of humanity finding out about these races pretty recent in terms of the events in the game, and I do think that leads to a lot more natural exploration of these dynamics from Shepard's perspective. But now let's run through the story here, where we do start off the game with Shepard being under the command of Captain Anderson, and we are tasked with recovering a Prothean beacon from a human colony named Eden Prime. And here we do get introduced to the first 2 party members in the game in Kaidan Alenko and Ashley Williams. Now, Kaidan sucks, and I've never really chosen to keep Kaidan alive when the option presents itself later in the game, because I just find Kaidan boring, and I think he never brings any semblance of intrigue to the story here in the first game. While Ashley is a character that I remember loving in my earlier playthroughs, and she was the romance option I did end up going with in my first playthrough of the game. But through my most recent replay, I will say that I did completely forget about this subplot around Ashley, that she's essentially the xenophobe, and that really just came out left field for me, and something I just simply didn't remember, as really most of what I remember from her were her roles within Mass Effects 2 and 3. So to see her come off as pretty negatively here in the first game was a bit of a surprise to me. Though even despite that, I do still find her backstory pretty interesting, and I do still find her one of the more complex characters within the crew. During the mission on Eden Prime, we do encounter Saren, a rogue Spectre that does become the central antagonist moving forward in the game, and Shepard ends up getting these visions from the beacon that do become a mystery in the early portions of the game of what do these visions mean. And all of this is a really interesting setup for the story moving forward, which to be honest ends up being a relatively basic plot. And while there are many side plots to get introduced along the way, the main plot really just revolves around investigating Saren and eventually taking him down. But they just end up adding so much to the story here to sidetrack you along the way, which, I mean, in reality is the majority of video game plots. Now afterwards, we do end up getting summoned to the Citadel, where our next objective is to convince the Citadel of Saren's betrayal. And I remember in my first playthrough, I really just hated this section of the game, where I always got lost in the Citadel. There were points where I simply just didn't know where I was going, what I was supposed to do. And this section does comprise of a lot of just walking around the Citadel, talking to NPCs to learn information that can be used to convince the Citadel. And this does go on for a while. Though through this, you do learn more about the lore of the world, which is interesting in its own right, and you do end up recruiting more people for your crew, namely Garrus, Rex, and Tali. Now, Garrus is pretty universally looked at as one of the best party members in the series, and he can act as your best friend figure over the course of the trilogy if he ends up surviving that long. Though I was surprised how many times the Paragon options conflicted with Garrus within this game, and because of me going for a Paragon playthrough, I did have to disagree with his opinions on things throughout a lot of this game. Rex is another character that I always liked, though I have always been disappointed with the fact that he is clearly the least important figure from this first game in terms of his potential involvement later on in the series. Where every other crew member within this game can potentially become a party member later on in the series, Rex is the only one to not do so. Then we have Tali, who, like Garrus, can become a party member through all three games, and I did like her as this sister-esque figure within the game. Now I know that you can romance her in future installments, though to me it always felt kind of bizarre and I never really went that route. But through Tali, we do learn more about Saren's plan, with him mentioning the Reapers, this race of ancient machines that are believed to eradicate organic civilizations every 50,000 years. Which, this idea of this game's universe being part of this cycle that repeats over and over again, and us having to stop this cycle, was an interesting part of the story for me, even though it does come off as a bit generic at points. But through convincing the Council of Saren's guilt, Shepard is appointed as the first human Spectre, given command of the Normandy from Anderson, and is tasked with tracking down Saren, which is pretty much the majority of the rest of the game. From this point, we are given three major tasks, the first of which is finding Liara Tassoni, an Asari scientist that ends up joining our squad, and is another one of the more complex squad members in the game. And her inclusion into the party leads to this weird love triangle between Shepard, Liara, and Ashley, where you're given the option of which one to romance. And again, I always went for Ashley during my original playthroughs of the game, and even in my most recent playthrough. Though I do think if I were to do it again, I do feel like Liara feels like the better option. But within the narrative, Liara is here to help us understand the Protheans, and in turn ends up helping Shepard understand his visions. Another task is going to Pharos, which is a human colony we need to save from the Geth, and I did find this section kind of annoying. Again, one of the few main sections in the game that forces you to use the Mako for an extended period of time, which just isn't fun. But also, I just found the overall level design here pretty confusing, and it didn't end up adding that much to the story here outside of learning about Sovereign, Saren's flagship, which plays an important role later on in the story. The final of these initial tasks is going to Novaria, which is a pretty lengthy section that I did at points find annoying in how a lot of it is just running around and talking to different NPCs in order to trying to find out how to leave the initial station. But once you do, you end up confronting Benezia, Liara's mother and Saren's second in command, who through defeating, we do learn that Sovereign is a living being that has mind-controlled both Benezia and Saren, and through this section we do also get one of the major choices in this game on whether or not to kill the Rachni Queen, essentially deciding the fate of this entire race, with them being potential allies later in the series if you do keep them alive. Now beyond this, we do learn that Saren's base is on Vermeer, which really kickstarts the endgame, where here we do get the first opportunities for party members to be killed. First off with Rex, where we do learn that Saren has found a cure for the genophage, this genetic Krogan disease, and through that plans to breed an army of Krogan. So through this, you have to carefully handle Rex when you are confronted by him. And if things go wrong, this confrontation can end with you killing Rex. After this, we do end up attacking Saren's base. Instead, we are confronted by Sovereign, who we find out is actually a Reaper. And this entire conversation is fantastic. One of my favorite moments in the first game here, with it revealing a lot of great lore and setup for future storylines. Though again, can be looked at as just a massive exposition dump. But it's also this part of the game where we do get another notable choice where we have to choose between saving Ashley or Kaidan. And come on, who is saving Kaidan here? Obviously I know people save Kaidan, but for me it was never really an option. Despite Ashley coming off as kind of unlikable at points within this game, she's still the way more interesting character in my eyes than Kaidan. And to me it was kind of funny that whenever I think of Mass Effects 2 and 3, I kind of forget that Kaidan can actually be in those games because of how pointless of a character he is in this first game. Afterwards, we do interact with Saren a bit here, where the game tries to humanize him, where again it's clear that he's being controlled by Sovereign, but we do learn that he's also just allowing this to happen as a way for him to actually try to save organics from the Reapers, which always felt like a completely misguided plan. But after this, we do return to the Citadel, where the Council refuses to further support our hunt for Saren, leading to us being grounded. And here we do get the help of Anderson to allow us to escape the Citadel with the Normandy and follow Saren to Ilos, a former Prothean world where the conduit that Saren has been searching for is located. And here we do interact with a Prothean VI named Vigil, where we do get more revelations about the world and how the Protheans were eradicated by the Reapers, plus also learning that the Citadel is actually a massive mass relay that the Reapers are going to use to invade the galaxy, essentially hiding it in plain sight, which is a pretty great reveal. And this leads to us now having to return to the Citadel to stop Saren from reactivating it, leading to the final confrontation at the Citadel, where we do get a final boss battle against Saren, now being fully possessed by Sovereign, which is a pretty standard boss battle. I'm not really super memorable, but overall I did like Saren as a villain. I do like the concepts behind his motivations. I do feel like it should have been explored a bit more, but I do like the role that he played in this game in terms of how he reveals us to the grander scale of this series' conflict. After this final battle, we are given a couple major decisions that do play a role in future installments. First, we do find out that the flagship that the Council is on needs assistance, essentially giving us a choice between saving them and losing a large amount of human casualties, or sacrificing them in order to focus on Sovereign. But realistically here, the major effect of this choice is whether or not the Council survives. But obviously, no matter what, we end up stopping Sovereign, and because of humanity's role in that, a human counselor gets introduced, through which we have to choose between Udina, this really sketchy politician from earlier in the game, or Anderson, our mentor figure that we spent a good chunk of the game looking up to, and him having done nothing against us. So again, I wonder who I'll choose. But really, the game ends here with the Reaper threat having been set up, that we obviously deal with over the course of Mass Effects 2 and 3. And that's really the entire game. Again, Mass Effect 1 is a game that I do have some reverence for. The core narrative is pretty strong. It has a really solid cast of characters. The attention to its world building is astronomical, and I do think this is a masterclass in terms of world building within the video game medium. While there is some filler within the story, I do still adore this game from a narrative perspective, but it's really everything else that holds this game back. Even in the Legendary Edition here, this game just doesn't hold up for me nearly as well as future games in the series. Even after just having played the prologue of Mass Effect 2, immediately after finishing this game, you instantly notice the jump in quality, where so much of this game's gameplay just comes off as a bit of a mess. While future games, while not perfect, they do come off as a lot more polished. Even Andromeda, as much slack as that game gets, I do think Mass Effect 1 struggles more gameplay-wise than Andromeda ever does. But really, a not as great Mass Effect game is still a game that I absolutely love. A game that I love more than most other games that are out there. My opinion of this game as a whole did go up during my most recent replay, and it did make me excited to get around to playing the later installments in the series, which I will be doing retrospectives moving forward of Mass Effect 2, 3, and Andromeda. Stay tuned for those, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.